the famous opera house of La Scala in Milan, it used to be common for the singers to hire a bunch of people to come in and cheer for them. So I brought 40 students with me. And to the speakers who are coming after me, for a small donation to the scholarship fund, they will cheer for you too. So the question I want to address this morning is, what obligation do businesses have to create a better society? So what is the purpose of business today? I want to suggest to you that we are facing an unprecedented opportunity for businesses to play a leading role in promoting human flourishing in our society. Businesses today can and should contribute significantly to fixing the major issues that plague our society, and not just poverty, but also inequality, environmental degradation, and the disintegration of community life and human relationships. Right now, many people look instead to government to solve these problems. But government is very limited in its ability to help on these major issues for several reasons. Our electorate is deeply divided, and so there's no consensus about how to fix these things. We have a massive federal debt, so our fiscal policy has very few degrees of freedom. And there's a sense of extensive cronyism in government, and so not surprisingly, trust in government is at an all-time low. These are Pew Center polls from the 1960s through to today, the percentage of people who trust the DC government, and the general trend is very clearly downward, right? So in the face of all this, some politicians say, hey, what we need is socialism, which is basically more government, right? So the medicine isn't working, let's have more medicine. It makes me think of the kind of bad old days of medicine where common cure was, or supposedly treatment was bleeding, right? Bloodletting. So we let blood out of the patient, he's not getting better, let's let more blood out. It's not very optimistic, but the issues of a deeply divided electorate, massive federal debt, cronyism, none of these are going to go away with socialism. They're just likely to get worse. Now, I talked about this at some length at the Napa Institute conference this past July in California. I'm going to recap the main points of that speech for those of you who weren't there, which I understand is the majority of you, and then I'm going to take it significantly further. So for those of you who were there, just to bear with me for the first few minutes, as it'll be a quick refresher, don't go away, and then we'll quickly move beyond that. So in Napa, I argued that socialism sets up a utopian expectation that the government will take care of everything, healthcare, education, so on. But no government is ever rich enough to do this, right, to take care of every citizen's every needs. And so the socialist state is always looking for ways to grab more and more property, right? So in order to try to afford this promise, which means citizens losing their property, ultimately losing their liberty. But, people say, capitalism has its own problems as well. Even the disintegration of community life and of human relationships is blamed on mass marketing and consumer culture. If these are all results of capitalism, people say, the way we practice it today, what are we going to do if we actually want to change things, if we want to improve our society? And I want to argue that Catholic social doctrine has a lot to teach us here and could be very helpful. At Napa, I discussed a number of principles from Catholic social doctrine which I believe can help us find a way forward, and I'm going to focus on 4 of those today. The first 2 are solidarity and subsidiarity. So solidarity, our responsibility to take care of others. Subsidiarity, the principle that decisions ought to be taken by those closest to the point of impact. The next 2 are private property and the universal destination of goods. The first says we have a right to private property, while the second says that God created the goods of the world for the benefit of all. These principles can seem to be in conflict with each other. In fact, 2 of them are typically associated with socialism and 2 with capitalism. So socialism, so the argument goes, wants to care for people, so that's solidarity, and they want all property to be shared, so that's the universal destination of goods, while capitalists highlight the subsidiarity, which is because we want individual decisions, and also we want private property. A question should be rising in your mind saying, hold on a minute. If these principles of Catholic teaching can be stretched to fit systems as widely divergent as capitalism and socialism, what is the point? What is the point of having Catholic social doctrine on the economy if it says socialism is okay and it says capitalism is okay? Why do we have that? So let's take a closer look. What socialism is really offering is just a perversion of these principles. It's not really in accord with these principles. It pretends to follow them, but it doesn't. So solidarity, care for others, is mostly left to the state in socialism. But true solidarity means each of us personally taking responsibility, as Pope Benedict wrote. He said, solidarity is first and foremost a sense of responsibility on the part of everyone with regard to everyone. It cannot therefore be merely delegated to the state. And socialism doesn't really share property, it just wants to take it all for itself. Right? So, however, capitalism, as it appears to be practiced today, in some people's view, seems to have its problems too. It might respect subsidiarity and private property in theory, but often not so much in practice. Right? So there's not much subsidiarity going on when larger businesses collude with government to the detriment of smaller businesses. And for all the enthusiasm we have for private property, did you know that in the United States today, only 18% of households have sufficient savings that they could live beyond 6 months without an income? Only 18%. Even worse, did you know that 63% of households in the United States do not have the ready resources to deal with a $500 emergency? That's almost two-thirds of the country do not have the cash savings to deal with a $500 emergency. That's a big problem. So it's not quite that both socialism and capitalism fit with Catholic teaching, but perhaps neither do. It's fair to ask, is it even possible to conceive of an economic system that fulfills these four principles, or is the church just being naive, right, and unrealistic? The principles seem to contradict each other. Should you be helping other people, which is solidarity, or should you leave them alone to help themselves, which is subsidiarity? Is property private, or should it have a universal destination? Is it meant for the benefit of all? These appear to be in conflict, right? The good news is there is a way to make sense of all of this. In fact, there is an economic system that fits with all of these principles without contradiction, and it is right in front of us much of the time. There's a reason I put the word capitalism on this slide in quotes, because I believe that what we call capitalism is not one thing, it's actually two things. I think there are actually two very different kinds of capitalism, one good and one bad, but we call them both by the same name. This was the main point of my comments at Napa. I'm recapping that here because I think it's really important, and then I'm going to build on that argument and take it further. The argument goes like this. Every business does two things. Every business creates value and captures value, right? So you create value, you produce something valuable for people, capture value, you take a share of that for yourself, you make a profit. Every business has to do both of these things. Explain this with a 2x2 matrix, because I'm a professor. So if you create value and you don't capture value, you're a not-for-profit or a charity, right? You're creating value, but you're not capturing any profit. If you capture value, but you don't create any, you're a thief, right? Simple as that. If you don't create or capture any value, you're an inanimate object, you're not alive. So to be a business, you have to both create value and capture it. But here's the thing. Of one of those two things, creating or capturing value, will always be your primary focus as a business. And here's where we get the two kinds of capitalism. Your primary focus determines what kind of capitalism you are practicing, good or bad. If your primary focus is on creating value for others, then that's good capitalism. We call that kind of capitalism entrepreneurial capitalism. Entrepreneurial capitalists create wealth for themselves by creating value for others, by serving others. They practice what we call principled entrepreneurship, the title of this theme of conferences. But if your primary focus is on capturing value, on making money regardless of the value you're creating for others, then that's bad capitalism. We call this imperialistic capitalism. If you're capturing more than you're contributing, then you're an imperialistic capitalist, you're a parasite, right? Imperialistic capitalism is all about the will to power. It's about imposing your will on others. It's about using others for your own gain. instead of serving them. It's crony capitalism. Right? So imperialistic capitalism is what leads to all the negative outcomes, to poverty, inequality, environmental destruction, disintegration of community life, and so on. These are not simply results of capitalism. They are results of imperialistic capitalism, a specific type of capitalism, the bad kind. So here's how this all fits with Catholic teaching. So I had labeled capitalism, what I should have put there, what I now put there is imperialistic capitalism. It's sort of a fake attempt at subsidiarity and private property. And socialism, as I said before, just delivers perversions of solidarity and universal destination. The economic system that does fulfill Catholic teaching, I believe, is entrepreneurial capitalism. It allows us to break the tension between these pairs of principles. Here's how. So entrepreneurial capitalists are guided by solidarity, by a desire to serve others. So they serve their customers, their employees, their investors. They also recognize that a good way to serve people is to support them in doing things for themselves, because that's more in accord with human dignity. And that's the principle of subsidiarity. So you can see how you bring those two principles together. If you provide training and development for your employees, for example, or your products and services help your customers become more successful. So entrepreneurial capitalist follows both solidarity and subsidiarity at the same time. And private property and the universal destination of goods come together at the same time. So private property says, you have the right to own goods. Universal destination says God made goods, the things of this world for the good of all. St. Thomas Aquinas taught us we should distinguish between the ownership and the use of property. As far as ownership is concerned, property is private. So the owner gets to decide what to do with it. As far as the use of property is concerned, we ought to use our property for the good of others. So you can summarize Catholic teaching about private property by saying that you have a right to your private property, you decide how to use it, and to be a good person, a faithful Catholic, you should use that property to serve others. How do we do that? We use our property to serve others when we spend it to help others. For example, using our property to take care of our families, feed them, clothe them, house them, and so on, or when we take care of aging parents, or a neighbor or a fellow parishioner in need, for example, or when we give to charity to support the church, for example. And importantly, we use our property for the good of others when we invest it. Right? Because when we invest it, we give other people opportunity to grow, to work, and so on. By the way, this went over well at Napa. I wanted to improve that PowerPoint icon of the family, make it more Catholic, there we go. So entrepreneurial capitalism aligns with the social doctrine because the social doctrine of the church, because it's focused on serving others, right? And because it's focused on serving others, it should be more attractive to everyone, including young people. It's more attractive than socialism because it's more caring than socialism. And that's where I ended the talk at Napa. Funnily enough, less than a month after I gave that speech, the Business Roundtable, which is an association of CEOs of many of the largest companies in the world, IBM, JP Morgan, Amazon, General Motors, they changed their statement on the purpose of a corporation. The statement used to say that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder wealth. The new statement stresses serving customers, employees, suppliers, local communities, shareholders. I was very pleased to see how quickly they responded to my speech. There was some controversy over it. Both the Wall Street Journal and especially The Economist criticized this move. The Economist wrote, however well-meaning, this new form of collective capitalism will end up doing more harm than good. Their point was that companies should not pursue broad public policy goals because business executives are not elected, right? They're not politicians, and so they should just focus on maximizing shareholder value. It's an interesting debate. I don't agree with that criticism, though, because I think being decent to your employees, to your customers, to your suppliers and local communities, that is hardly a matter of public policy. It's just basic decency, right? It's also hardly a new idea, to be fair. As our next speaker, David Bahnsen, pointed out in an article he wrote in the National Review, this is an idea that's been around for a while. But I do think I see where the issue lies. The core question, it seems to me, is do we or do we not want companies to try to be moral? It's as simple as that, right? Do we want them to just focus on making as much money as they can? If so, that's imperialistic capitalism with all the problems that it brings. Or do we want them to take a moral perspective on what they do and what they make and how they work with their employees and their customers and communities and so on? I would say yes. I think we do want them to take a moral view. And incidentally, if you don't, you can line yourself up with others who don't want companies taking a moral view, including the Obama administration. Because during the Hobby Lobby case, it's the Supreme Court, a key point in the Obama administration's argument was that the purpose of business is solely to make a profit, and therefore religious liberty doesn't apply to corporations. This was in 2013. It happened to be the very year we founded our business school at Catholic University, soon to become the Bush School of Business. And so I argued in a little amicus brief to that case, saying, well, if the government is right, we may as well shut down our business school, because we dedicated this business school to bringing Catholic teaching into business. So I don't think it was a turning point in the argument, by the way. But the point I hope stands. We do want businesses to take a moral view. The problem is, if we're going to allow businesses to have a moral perspective, we've got to recognize that sometimes they're going to get it wrong. There are very different ideas about what is and isn't moral in our country right now, and this complicates things. So, for example, if you're a Christian, you want, on the one hand, for the baker to have the right to not bake a wedding cake for a gay wedding, rather than violate his principles. At the same time, you don't want, I think, Disney pressuring the state of Georgia into not passing pro-life legislation. Is this consistent? Both the baker and Disney appear to think that they are making the decisions for moral reasons. So how could we support one and not the other? I'm going to set aside the important, nevertheless important, but I'm going to set aside the question of the actual soundness of the moral reasoning of each, because that opens up a complicated line of argument, which is not the point of what I'm trying to get to, but I want to recognize there are those complex questions. I also want to set aside the question of whether a company like Disney is actually attempting to take a moral stance or is just engaging in what is now being called woke washing. So woke washing is, so this word woke means to be awake to social justice issues, right? So woke capitalism is, as some of our speakers will talk about today, is capitalism that is awake to social justice. Woke washing, though, is pretending to be awake, so that you can be seen like to be seen like a caring company, and it usually backfires happily. So is Disney sincere, or are they just woke washing? I actually think that they must be sincere. They must genuinely think they're acting morally in opposing the Georgia abortion law, because for any other reason, it just makes no sense. If there's one company in the world that would benefit from there being more babies in the world, it would be Disney, right? So I have to think they actually just think this is a moral stance that they're taking. So setting those two issues aside, is there a difference between these two cases that will allow us to say that in the one case, he should be able to act on what he perceives to be moral, and the other, no? There is a difference, and it's a fairly basic difference, but I think an important one. The baker is a small company, and Disney is a very large company. So if the baker's morality ends up being messed up, hardly anyone is going to get hurt, if anybody, right? But if Disney's morality is messed up, a lot of people can get hurt. If the baker doesn't want to serve the gay couple could go and buy a wedding cake somewhere else, right? And if the baker is located in a community where there are many gay weddings, then he may have to move or go out of business, right? The market tends to take care of these things when the companies are small. Just give an opposite example for you. Some time ago, a new pizzeria opened up in my hometown of Great Falls, Virginia. The pizza place called themselves Jesus Crust. Haha, very funny, right? So in my family, we love pizza, and with 6 kids, we eat a lot of pizza. But I would never take them to a restaurant that had a blasphemous name like that, so we never went. Now, apparently a lot of my neighbors thought the same way because this company is no longer in business. Right? So the market does take care of these things. But if a big company like Disney pulls out of Georgia, which has a major film industry, a lot of people in the film industry there are going to get hurt. So the issue, it seems to me, is not whether companies should take a moral view on the decision-making or not. The answer to that should be yes, they should. The issue is a completely different one. How do we deal with large companies who, acting on what they believe are moral reasons, do something we find to be immoral. And it's not just about how they treat people outside the company, but it's also inside the company. The employees who feel pressure to conform to whatever politically correct views are favored by management at the moment. The root problem of this is, again, imperialistic capitalism, right? So companies trying to impose their will on others. The small baker isn't really imposing his will on anyone. In fact, if anything, others are imposing on him. But the large company Disney is trying to impose its will on the people of the state of Georgia. What is the solution to this problem? I don't think I actually see a solution to this problem right now. While our country is so divided on what morality is, in practice, it's impossible to get any kind of consensus. So what do? I think there's actually a much larger issue that we should be paying attention to, which, if we can address this larger issue, would make the issue I just mentioned about the morality of large corporations less important. This larger issue is a very big issue, one that this country has grappled with since independence. Unfortunately, I don't think we've been paying enough attention to it lately. And the issue is the one of concentration of wealth and power in the hands of crony capitalists, imperialistic capitalists. The concentration that arises typically when big business and big government collude in cronyism with each other. In Napa, I talked about how decades of research by the economist John Powelson showed that concentration of wealth and power is antithetical to economic growth and also to prosperity. Today, I'd like to take that a bit further because I think this is a really big deal. The argument of the dangers of concentration of wealth and power is made most famously by Friedrich Hayek in his book, The Road to Serfdom. The argument is that the concentration of wealth and power will lead to the destruction of capitalism and of a free society. So imperialistic capitalism leads to its own destruction, as well as the destruction of entrepreneurial capitalism and of freedom as well. Interestingly enough, in The Road to Serfdom, in a little footnote that almost everybody misses, Hayek gives credit to an earlier book by Hilaire Belloc called The Servile State. So Hilaire Belloc was an English Catholic historian and apologist, Catholic apologist of the early 20th century, a close friend of G.K. Chesterton. In fact, he brought Chesterton into the Catholic Church. Belloc argued that the concentration of ownership of the means of production into a small number of hands is not compatible with a society based on principles of freedom and equality, like ours. Because when wealth, and therefore power, is concentrated in a few hands, the majority of people don't feel neither free nor equal. It feels like we're free in theory, but not in practice. When 63% of the country don't have the ready cash to deal with a $500 problem, what's the point of freedom, they think, right? No wonder we see such a rise of populism and socialism. People are fed up, right? They're told they live in a free country, that we're all created equal, but they're not feeling very free or very equal right now. I think one could make the case that this is the crisis of our time, the concentration of wealth and power. Arguably, it's not just behind the current rise in socialism, but it was also behind the Tea Party movement, behind the Occupy movement, and behind the Trump populist movement, right? All of these things have this common root. That's why I think it's such a big deal. It's really the same thing that they are all bothered about. So what should we do? The solution in theory, like so many things, is simple, though hard to do. We need to have more widespread property ownership, right? We need more people to have capital. Frankly, we need more capitalists, more entrepreneurial capitalists, of course. But we need more people to have capital. Someone once said, I think it was Chesterton, although I haven't been able to verify this, that either property is evil, in which case nobody should have any, or else it's good, in which case we'd want as many people as possible to have some. If a significantly larger proportion of our society were owners of their own businesses, of investments in businesses, they wouldn't feel so marginalized, and socialism wouldn't stand a chance. You think about it, right? If there were property owners, there wouldn't be such enthusiasm for the government taking property. The real challenge is how to get to the point where we have more widespread property ownership. You know, and any kind of confiscation, redistribution, the Robin Hood is never going to work because it's first of all, it's materially unjust, right? There's serious justice issues there. politically very difficult. And being a property owner is not just a question of being given some money, right? One has to have the skills, one has to know how to own that property, how to invest it, how to care for it. Otherwise, you lose it pretty quickly. Chesterton and Belloc promoted an economic order they called distributism that was based on widespread property ownership. The idea is sound, I think, but it suffers from the name. To those who don't know what it is, distributism makes it sound like property redistribution, right? Which is not what they meant. What they meant was an economic system where lots of people had capital, where by distributed they meant the adjective, not the past participle, right? So the root problem, and this is where I think is exactly right. The root problem, according to Belloc, was: do people actually want to be owners, right? Do sufficient numbers of people prefer property and independence, or do they prefer a salary and dependence, right? Do they want freedom and responsibility or servility and security? It is a real question. In the United States, this question goes back at least to the founding of the Republic. So perhaps you recall a famous quote from Samuel Adams, his speech to the Pennsylvania State House, August 1st, 1776. "If ye love wealth greater than liberty, the tranquility of servitude greater than the animating contest for freedom, go home from us in peace. We seek not your counsel nor your alms. Crouch down and lick the hand that feeds you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen." What an awesome attitude, right? But does that attitude still exist in this country, in the majority of our citizens? We need to find a way to reignite, to restore this original understanding of the importance of property for liberty, to have more people to want this, right? To encourage the desire for freedom and responsibility that comes with property ownership, to encourage entrepreneurial capitalism. How should we do this? There are some important things that people are doing right now. For example, it's well recognized that most regulation falls much more heavily on small businesses than on larger ones. And so the Small Business Administration and others work constantly to try to remedy this. The Cato Institute has for many years done important work against corporate welfare, which is government handouts to large corporations. And that's very important here too, because anything that privileges larger corporations over smaller ones is harmful to entrepreneurial capitalism and to entrepreneurs. It's harmful to small businesses, and it fosters imperialistic capitalism. In terms of encouraging more entrepreneurship and property ownership, groups like Youth Entrepreneurs, our own SEED program at Catholic U in the Sioka Center. The SEED stands for Catholic Entrepreneurship and Design Experience. These are good examples. We support entrepreneurship clubs in high schools to get kids learning about the values and importance of entrepreneurship early on. And there are also several not-for-profits that focus on what they call what was called asset building, which is promoting savings and capital accumulation, especially among poorer families. All these are very important, but they're just not enough. Things seem to be getting worse, not better. So we need to do more. We need to be looking for some sort of 10x solution, some order of magnitude solution. And here's what I think we should do. As religious people, so far we have offered a religious defense of the market economy. Right? The work of the Acton Institute for Faith, Work and Economics, of course, of the Bush School, we've all made contributions here, making a moral and religious defense of the market economy. But perhaps it's time to stop playing defense. Perhaps it's time to go on the offense. It's time to take the initiative and stop saying that the market economy is merely compatible with Catholic social doctrine. It's time to say that we have a moral and religious obligation to serve the poor in a way that actually works, right? That helps get the poor out of poverty and keeps them out of poverty. And entrepreneurial capitalism and property ownership are very effective ways and proven ways to help the poor. So we have a moral obligation to put these forward, not just to play defense. Look, God cares about the poor, no question, right? God also cares about freedom. Look at this beautiful quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. God has not willed to reserve to himself all exercise of power. He entrusts to every creature the functions it is capable of performing. This mode of governance ought to be followed in social life. The way God acts in governing the world, which bears witness to such great regard to human freedom, should inspire the wisdom of those who govern human communities. So God made us free and wants us to live in freedom. And now here's something that might surprise you. Because God cares about the poor, and because God cares about freedom, I think that God also cares about property. He really does. I think we find this hard to grasp because our contemporary notions of property are so distorted. Today, I think most people, when they hear the word property, they think of luxury goods like cars, vacation homes, fancy yachts, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against any of these things. I love sailing. I've owned several boats in my lifetime. It's always fun to go sailing with my kids, you know. And we've had the pleasure of sailing on some pretty big yachts in vacation as well. Right now, I have a very small boat. That's me on a small boat. But that's all I have time for. So I'm not saying any of these things are bad, but I do think our notion of property has become distorted by the vice of consumerism. Consumerism is the idea that happiness in life comes from having and consuming more stuff, which we know is false, right? As St. John Paul II wrote, St. John Paul II, whose memorial we celebrate today, it's not wrong to want to live better. What is wrong is a style of life which is presumed to be better when it is directed towards having rather than being, which wants to have more, not in order to be more, but in order to spend life in enjoyment as an end in itself. So that's the problem we have with our understanding of property. So what would be a non-consumerist understanding of property? I think a non-consumerist understanding of property is productive property, right? Property that you use to produce wealth, to support yourself, your family, to take care of others. So investments, tools, rental homes, factories, hotels, computers, trucks, and so on, right? That's the kind of property that God cares about, I think, and that the church has defended down through the centuries. Look, from the very beginning, God gave Adam property, right? The Garden of Eden, and he said, till it, right? Till it and keep it. He didn't say kick back and enjoy watching the animals, right? So God gave us property and said, work with it, right? And now here's the Second Vatican Council on property, on productive property here. So the Council Fathers wrote that private property or some ownership of external goods confers on everyone a sphere wholly necessary for the autonomy of the person and the family. And it should be regarded as an extension of human freedom. If you look carefully at the wording, the Council is not saying that because we are free, we have a right to private property. The emphasis is the other way around. Private property is itself necessary for the exercise of freedom. The Catechism says something similar. So property is legitimate for guaranteeing the freedom and dignity of persons. Property guarantees freedom, because if you have no property, then you're always dependent on somebody else. So here's what I propose as a 10x solution, one that I think could make a dramatic increase in the number of entrepreneurs, the number of property owners, the amount of entrepreneurial capitalism in this country. The solution I'd like to propose that as Christian entrepreneurs and investors, recognizing the dangerous state we are in when so few citizens are property owners, we each take it as our moral responsibility to spread entrepreneurial capitalism and private property ownership ourselves personally by identifying future entrepreneurs within our companies, mentoring them, investing in them, allowing them to become entrepreneurs, and teaching all of our employees how to save, how to invest, and as far as possible, allowing them to invest in our own companies, right? Some of you have tried employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, for example. And I don't mean do this to the extent that you're convinced definitively that it's going to be more financially advantageous. It might be, it probably will be, because employees work harder when they are also owners, right? And because God himself will not be outdone by generosity. But I think we need to do this anyway, because this is how we are going to save our country, by dramatically increasing the number of property owners and entrepreneurs, and only entrepreneurs ourselves can actually do this at a scale that will make a difference. No not-for-profit, no government is going to be able to do this at a 10x level, but I think together we could do this, together with God and prayer and sacraments, of course. I think we should say that the purpose of entrepreneurial capitalism, the purpose of each firm today, is not just to serve society through its products and services, employment and profit. It should be to replicate itself by creating more entrepreneurial capitalists. And if we do this, the issues of poverty, of inequality, the feeling of disempowerment, they start to go away. Because we'll be tackling the root cause, not the symptoms. So I argue that the main problem of our time, and the reason we're so vulnerable to socialism, is the concentration of wealth and power, which makes citizens feel not very free and equal, and that the solution is to achieve more widespread property ownership, more entrepreneurship, more capitalists, by taking it as our moral responsibility as entrepreneurs to increase the number of entrepreneurs, the number of capitalists. And that the true purpose of business right now is not just to serve society by providing good services and profits, but is to save society by restoring widespread property ownership to this country. If we do this, and I think only if we do this, can we save this country. Thank you.